Welcome to the podcast series on mainstreaming SGBV risk mitigation in humanitarian action. I am your host, Liloba Paul, Staff Development Officer on topics related to sexual and gender-based violence. This work is brought to you by the Safe from the Start Project, a collaboration between UNHCR's Division of International Protection and the Global Learning and Development Center in Budapest. Our topic today is risk management and SGBV risks. It is my pleasure to have with me Kapur Keeble, Senior Enterprise Risk Management Officer based in UNHCR's headquarters in Geneva. Welcome, Oscar.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Welcome also to all of our listeners. I'd like to start off by asking, what is Risk Management 2.0? And can you tell everyone a bit more about this process?
Sure. So the Risk Management 2.0 initiative really functions at two different levels. One is about the processes and resources needed to implement a modern enterprise-wide approach to risk management. And the additional thing of Risk Management 2.0 specifically was the creation for a limited period of time of senior risk advisor posts in some of our most high-risk operations. But the other, perhaps more important aspect of the Risk Management 2.0 initiative was about strengthening the risk culture of UNHCR. The High Commissioner often talks about staff in UNHCR developing a risk reflex. And what a risk reflex means is that we consistently and thoroughly think through the uncertainties we face, how they could affect our ability to deliver our mandate and serve persons of concern. And given these uncertainties, what actions and steps do we need to take to maximize the likelihood and extent of success? Now, you could reasonably say that that is precisely what good managers and personnel have always done in UNHCR throughout our history, and you wouldn't be wrong. But the idea is that by enhancing our risk culture and developing this reflex, that this level and way of thinking is done by everyone all the time, not just most people most of the time.
So that means all staff are responsible for addressing risks within their respective areas of responsibility, and we need to build this into our organizational culture.
Yes, absolutely. So the risk management process itself is a tool to help us achieve this stronger risk culture and to make sure that we are focusing on the things that matter and that we take smart, well-informed decisions to help us deliver protection, assistance, and solutions. The process we use in UNHCR is based on an international standard, and at a high level, it involves a few key steps. First is understanding the context. What are our objectives? What are we trying to achieve? What is the environment we are in like? Who are our key stakeholders and what do they expect from us, and so forth. Then, given our objectives and our context, what are the risks and opportunities that face us? And once we've identified these risks and opportunities, we analyze and evaluate them to help us decide how best to respond. And that's what we call risk mitigation or risk treatment. Then, and this is the key step, we implement those responses. But not only that, while we are implementing our treatments and our mitigations, we are also all the time alert to new potential emerging risks and opportunities, to changes in our context, and to whether the actions that we're taking are being implemented properly, and if they're actually having the effect that we thought they would. So risk management is a cycle rather than a linear process. And all of this we can record in an online risk register using a tool that's developed specifically for UNHCR. And to improve accountability, the operation also needs to know who will implement these risk treatments and by when. And this is also recorded in the tool. And in fact, now, if you are assigned as a treatment owner, you will receive an automatic reminder once a quarter reminding you these treatments are assigned to you to implement in order to manage risks.
I see. And in protection, we indeed might refer to risk treatments as risk mitigation measures. And what are some of the key challenges that you see staff experience when carrying out their responsibilities related to the risk management process?
Mm. So, in terms of challenges, I think the biggest one is the challenge of being able to make the time and space to be able to step back, lift up your head, and take a deep breath and just think about what the biggest risks and opportunities currently facing you are and what you should do about them. As a humanitarian organization, we, by necessity, spend so much of our time reacting. And, in addition to all the evolving needs and circumstances of persons of concern, which require time to process and respond to, we will get pulled into an interagency coordination meeting. We'll have to brief the government on a particular issue. We will need to respond to information requests from the Bureau or HQ. We'll need to do a monitoring visit to a partner, and so on. And all of these important things take time to plan, to think through, and to implement. And with so much to do in such a short space of time, we can easily get swept up in the day to day, running at 200 kilometers per hour and not being able to, as the ethics office likes to remind us to stop, pause, and reflect. So, in part, the risk management process, which formally needs to be done at least annually, is designed to force us to stop and take the time to do this. But risks don't move at an annual speed. Our thinking needs to be at the speed of the risks we face. And that's why the more that we can consistently integrate this risk reflex into our daily working lives, the better we will be able to manage the uncertainty that we have to deal with, and the less of a bureaucratic burden risk management will be on us because we're doing it every day.
Yes, this is a good reminder. And the risk management process offers us several tools as UNHCR staff to manage some of those challenges. What are some of those tools you and your team are working on?
Well, the main tool at the field level would be the Country Operation Risk Register. So, this should capture the key strategic risks and opportunities related to the achievement of the operation's main goals. Now, as of 2020, the average number of risks per operation was 14, although some had as many as 30. So you can see it's at quite a strategic high level. While we don't set a number of risks that you should or shouldn't have, we do think that 14 is a better number than 30, because when you get as many as 30 risks, it's not really a succinct set of priority risks that you can actively manage, all the time. And even if you have 30 risks, that's not a lot across everything that an operation has to do, from procurement to security to partnership management, delivering NFIs or cash assistance, preventing, mitigating, and responding to SGBV, child protection, RSD, you name it. So the point is that the risk register really is a high level prioritized set of key risks. Now, on top of the basic information and analysis in the risk register, in the ERM unit, we've developed several reports that you can run to allow you to analyze that data, either in your operation or in your region or actually globally. So, for example, you can in the tool generate a chart showing the treatments that you have planned to implement, their different target dates and so on, and who's assigned to do those. So you have actually already a work plan that's automatically generated. You can also download different kinds of management information and see the different trends in risks and their breakdown. Now, although not all staff have access to the risk register tool, in your operation, the representative will, and also the risk focal points, and they can easily run these reports and share them with you as a PDF or an Excel document. Also, as I mentioned briefly before, you can now assign individual staff members as owners of specific treatments, and they will receive automatic reminders once a quarter of the treatments that are assigned to them which are due. And this is something that personally I've found very helpful as a treatment owner, getting this timely reminder that said, hey, you had this big important thing that you were meant to do.
Definitely.
Yes.
Yeah, both the available risk reports and automatic reminders sound useful.
Yes, and one other tool that we're currently working on, we're spending a lot of effort now trying to figure out how best to use the risk data that we have to identify and share best practices. Now, over the years since 2014, when enterprise risk management was introduced, operations have identified thousands of risks. And right now, today, there's over 1,700 active risks in the tool. So, as a pilot, we took cash-based interventions risks. And one of my colleagues, she identified all the common risks, their causes, their consequences, and the different things that different operations have planned to do about them. And we packaged this in a short document that was shared with all the CBI officers so they can see what their peers are doing in other operations to manage these common challenges. And in the future, we will look to do similar things in other areas after consulting with the divisions, and possibly including a similar package on SGBV related risks. There's a specific risk category in the risk management framework on security from violence and exploitation, which after the 2020 risk analysis risk review was actually the fastest growing category. So it's quite straightforward for us to take this information and then begin to do this kind of analysis on what the common risks and treatments are.
Thank you. There are many staff in the field who would find a compilation on how different operations are addressing SGBV risks helpful. It would also be good to look at within other categories for SGBV risks, look at what the reports would say, such as basic needs and services or emergency preparedness and response. And one tool that we use to help mainstream SGBV risk mitigation within sectors is the risk statement. And this is used in the risk register tool that you mentioned. And I think this structure has been extremely useful in terms of the feedback we've received from operations engaged in the mainstreaming workshops. The structure allows more context to be added to the description of a risk, and it's done in a way that can be understood by a much larger audience at the operation, the country, or even at the regional level. And this has helped multifunctional teams to speak a more common language and begin to address parts of SGBV risks within different areas of responsibility. Either it's within a technical sector or even what UNHCR does in terms of more specialized work, RSD, RST. I'd like to ask too if you could tell us more about the risk register tool and how this tool for management can be used to improve accountability related to SGBV related risks in an operation.
Absolutely. So, as you say, the risk statement itself is already a key part of the analysis. So, we structure a risk statement in three parts: causes, risk event, and consequences. So if we take the example of a negative risk, something bad that we want to stop happening, such as increased incidences of SGBV in a given population of concern, we would then formulate a risk statement in something like the following logic. So if causes A, B, and or C happen, then there may be increased incidences of SGBV, resulting in negative consequences X, Y, Z, and so on. Now, breaking down the risk in this way is helpful because it guides you in what action you need to take. So, when we look at the individual causes, you can say, well, what could we do to stop A, B, and C from happening? Would better training stop it? Would updating SOPs stop it? Are there preventive controls that we can implement to stop these things from happening, which would cause more SGBV? Then, when we look at the risk event, the question we can ask ourselves is, how would we even know if incidences of SGBV increased? Is our communication with communities effective enough? Are there barriers that would stop people coming forward? Is there anything that we could do to get rid of those barriers? Are we properly identifying and recording and tracking the incidences of SGBV that we do become aware of? Then finally, when we look at the negative consequences, we can ask, what can we do to limit and mitigate these negative impacts? How can we support survivors to lessen the impact on them as much as we can? What lessons can we learn to prevent future occurrences? And so on. Now, over the years, my colleagues and I have gone through this exercise for so many different risks in different operations, generally in a multifunctional setting. And what we tend to find when we go through this thinking is that typically 80% of the things that we talk about are already firmly in the work plan, in the SOPs, and are reflected. Then there'll be another 10% that is kind of on people's minds, but not explicitly addressed anywhere. And then there's maybe a final 10% that we hadn't thought of before. And this doesn't need to be a time-consuming analysis. Sometimes you can follow through this process in as little as 20 minutes. And more often than not, you do tend to generate potential responses or potential causes that you hadn't thought of before. So it can be a very powerful tool.
Yes, that is another point to emphasize. And also the need to break down risks using a systematic approach. You spoke about survivors, and right now, this emphasis of mainstreaming SGBV risk mitigation, we're talking about before the incident even occurs and before there are survivors, what can be done. And I think there's a wide range that fits into even that, either the 20% or the 10% you just spoke of that hadn't been considered before. How can we address this?
Yeah.
And when SGBV risks are addressed by staff across the operation rather than only protection, we are more effective in reducing the exposure of at-risk groups to particular kinds of SGBV risks, found also in our processes and procedures. You mentioned SOPs, so even looking there within different technical sectors too. And how we carry out our work matters in humanitarian context. We're not just delivering a product. So, for example, we use the tools available to us to build into our planning cycles participation and empowerment of marginalized persons of concern, and work in collaboration with partners to establish community feedback and response mechanisms. These are just some examples, but these types of measures are most effective when implemented with systematic follow-up rather than as an ad hoc or one-time intervention.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with this idea that protection is something that all UNHCR personnel and partners need to think about. And when we deliver risk management training in the field, we try as much as logistics to allow to include all the personnel, right from the G4 driver up to the head of the office or the representative. And that's because when everyone has a risk reflex and is not just thinking in terms of their own specific area of work, but is actually switched on and thinking about the operation's overall objectives and, the overall lives of the people that we're meant to be serving, we can pick up so much more. I've met drivers whose job title really should have been driver/assistant protection associate, because honestly, they use their eyes and their ears and they notice things that international staff generally can't. So picture a driver waiting to pick up a protection officer from a registration center, and that driver's watching the guards interact with persons of concern who are approaching the center. Now, the driver is likely local, speaks the language, understands the culture, and what's more, people behave very differently in front of a driver than they would do in front of a P3 protection officer. So if that driver notices something that doesn't seem quite right and flags it to protection, then that can start the ball rolling and potentially lead to identifying some major issues that, if that driver hadn't have said anything, might have gone unnoticed for months more. And this is what a strong risk culture and a risk reflex mean. It means that all of us are alive to the possibilities and uncertainties that impact the goals of the organization. Sexual exploitation by guards might be happening in this particular location. A small project here could dramatically empower vulnerable people and reduce the risk of them resorting to negative coping mechanisms, and so on. And the more that all colleagues adopt this way of thinking, the more we will be able to identify and respond to the opportunities and risks that present themselves to us.
And the risk register focuses on risks to the operation that impede UNHCR's ability to deliver on its operational objectives, or equally opportunities that could allow us to meet or even exceed our objectives. As a protection agency, one of those main operational objectives is improving protection outcomes for persons of concern. Can the risk management process and tools be applied to managing SGBV risks?
Yes, 100% they can. So, as I mentioned before, the risk register of a given operation is quite high level and strategic. So, let's say you have 20 risks at the country level, then there may be at most 2 or 3 high level risks on SGBV that capture the most critical treatments that the representative and senior management team need to actively monitor the delivery of. But at a lower level, there's nothing to stop staff applying the tools from the risk management process in more detail. So, for example, when you develop an SOP, a good practice is to think about what the risks and opportunities are at each step of the process. Again, there's nothing revolutionary in this way of thinking, and in many cases, we do this naturally without even thinking about it. Pretty much every registration SOP I've ever read, for example, has steps designed to identify potential victims of SGBV and ensure that appropriate follow up and referrals are happening. In the case of cash-based interventions, the global template, even for the SOPs, means that you need to think about the protection risks and unintended consequences of CBI, and then think through what mitigations you can do to manage those. So yes, the risk management process can certainly be applied to manage any risks, including SGBV risks, at quite a granular level.
Okay, and we do need to distinguish between the exposure of at-risk groups to certain SGBV risks and the risks posed to the organization. The sexual exploitation and abuse, for example, is one example of an intolerable risk to persons of concern and a major risk to the reputation of the organization, breaking the trust between UNHCR and the persons we're mandated to protect.
Yes, this is very true. I mentioned before that security from violence and exploitation was the fastest growing risk category in 2020, and it's now the fourth highest category in terms of the number of high risks identified. So it's only behind fair protection processes and documentation, emergency preparedness and response, and then basic needs and services. So it's really a high risk in the organization as identified in the field. When we dig a bit more into the data, we see that the big majority of new risks in this category relate directly to sexual exploitation and abuse. Now, we can't tell for sure how much of this increase is driven by just more awareness on the one hand, or on the other hand, by a possible increase in the underlying threat of sexual exploitation and abuse that we are facing. My hunch is that the underlying risk has remained largely the same, but we're just now much more aware of the prevalence of SEA and the devastating impact that it can have, especially in the wake of the recent scandals that rocked Oxfam in particular. So now everyone's acutely aware that in the current environment, SEA not only first and foremost has a really disastrous effect for the people that it directly affects, for the victims, but it also hurts and diminishes the organization. And in many cases, a diminished UNHCR means diminished protection for persons of concern. And we can soon find ourselves in a very vicious circle where SEA occurs, it is seen to have occurred, and then this then leads to reduced funding or suspended funding from donors. And that in turn leads to reduced controls and reduced assistance to people, and then higher risks of more SEA happening, and also of other forms of SGBV occurring again in the future. And because of all of this, it is doubly important that we proactively manage SEA risks, and wherever we possibly can, we stop it from happening.
And yes, thank you for bringing that up and making those links. Part of the Safe from the Start project and the SGBV mainstreaming components are about knowledge, skills, and attitudes of staff related to SEA, but also related to SGBV prevention, risk mitigation, and response more widely. So, what we're focusing on now and making sure that operations are aware and have a similar thinking across the operations definitely links strongly here with risk management. Are there any messages you would like to share with staff about the added value of the risk management process?
Sure. So, as I said at the start, risk management isn't something new. And in some senses, it is just good management. And in UNHCR, we have been dealing with and managing risks throughout our existence. But what enterprise risk management and the Risk Management 2.0 initiative attempt to add to this is to introduce a consistent, systematic, and structured framework around existing practices. And this adds value in a few different ways. So, first, it helps to raise the bar of the weakest areas. Today, a scandal or a significant failure in a small or medium sized field office in one operation actually has the potential to impact the entire organization and undermine our ability to serve persons of concern globally. So it's not enough to manage risks reasonably well in 90% of locations. It has to be in 100% of them. And so having a structured framework helps us get there. Second, by introducing standard categories and definitions of impact and likelihood and so on and processes, we can begin to meaningfully collect and analyze risk data that's consistent because people are using the same language. And that can inform decision making at the regional and HQ levels as well as at the field. You know, the information entered into risk registers doesn't just sit there. It's really used. The regional bureau carefully look at it when they do their own risk assessments and planning. In the ERM unit, we provide the division's reports of the risks in the field in their areas. What are the trends? What are the common concerns, and how might they need to think about that in their own work? You know, and the senior executive team carefully review the trends and analysis of global risks, and that informs their own assessment of the strategic risks and the global challenges that face UNHCR. And finally, as I mentioned before, so having this time to stop, pause, and reflect in the hectic world we work in is priceless. And we appreciate the irony that one of the reasons that our work is so hectic is because we have so many processes to do, and that the risk review and risk management is indeed one more process. However, I would argue that when it's done well, after we've figured out what our objectives are, the risk management process is actually the key step in helping us figure out what's most important and where to focus our actions and limited time so that we add the most value to persons of concern that we possibly can. So that's what I would say is the added value of having this structured enterprise-wide risk management approach.
And the risk management process refers also to proactive risk treatments or risk mitigation. And the measures we put in place based on an SGBV risk analysis done before an SGBV incident occurs can have intended and unintended impacts. That means that staff must remain aware of both as they take action to reduce risks. For SGBV related risks being treated by technical sectors, the risk mitigation measures should be developed in consultation with protection or SGBV staff, as also advised in the interagency IASC GBV guidelines. And another added value of the risk management process is what we as UNHCR staff in different sectors and areas of work do to address the identified risks, not only discuss them.
Yes, absolutely. Risk registers are tools, not products. I mean, we want them to be good, but ultimately we don't care that it's a nice, shiny, well-structured document because They're tools to help us figure out how to best achieve our objectives, how best to protect, respond, include, power, and solve in an uncertain world. And so they only really add value to the extent that they help us take the right actions. And when we have a risk reflex, when we have a strong risk culture, that's when we are best placed to take the right decisions to maximize the likelihood and extent that UNHCR succeeds for persons of concern. And that's when we can say, yes, risk management is adding value to our work.
Thank you, Oscar, for sharing your time and expertise with us and for reminding us to move at the speed of the risks we face, but also take time to stop, pause, and reflect.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you. We will conclude by highlighting a few key messages on risk management and SGBV risks. Everyone in the organization is responsible for risk management. UNHCR's ERM policy includes SGBV under the risk category Security from Violence and Exploitation. SGBV risks can be mitigated in other areas as well, such as fair protection processes and documentation, basic needs and services, oversight, accountability, and ethics, to name a few. The ultimate added value of the risk management process is the risk treatment, or in other words, the actions taken or measures put in place to mitigate a risk. And each area of our work has the potential to mitigate SGBV risks. Thank you for joining us. To all of our listeners, do tune in to the next podcast in our series from the GLDC on mainstreaming SGBV risk mitigation in humanitarian action.